My name is Daniel Whitfield, and before I tell you what happened on the morning the bulldozers showed up at my property line, I need you to understand something about the land I live on. It has been in my family since 1968. My grandfather bought 11 acres on the edge of a small town, back when the area was mostly farmland and gravel roads. He built a modest house, put up a cedar fence along the eastern boundary, and had that boundary surveyed and filed with the county the same year he closed on the property. That fence line has not moved 1 inch in over 50 years. I know, because I inherited both the land and the paperwork, and I kept every page of it. I want to tell you this story slowly, because the way it unfolded taught me something important about paperwork, patience, and the difference between an organization that thinks it has power and an organization that actually has the law on its side. This is a story about a homeowners association that decided my fence was in the wrong place, and about the moment their bulldozer operator turned off his engine because a single sheet of paper, 50 years older than anything the HOA had ever filed, stopped the machine before it took a single bite out of my land. Let me back up. When my grandfather passed, the property came to my mother, and when she passed a few years later, it came to me. I moved in permanently about 6 years ago, mostly to get out of city life and have some space to breathe. The land backs up against a newer development called Fairview Ridge, which didn't exist when my grandfather built his fence. Fairview Ridge went up about 15 years ago, long after my family's boundary was already established, surveyed, and recorded. The developers built right up to what they believed was the property line, and for a long time, nobody questioned anything. The fence sat there quietly, doing what fences do, marking a boundary that had been legally settled since before most of the Fairview Ridge residents were born. The trouble started, as these things often do, with a new HOA board. About 8 months ago, Fairview Ridge elected a new HOA president, a man named Gary Holloway. I want to be fair to Gary. I don't think he woke up one morning wanting to make my life difficult. I think he genuinely believed, based on a modern survey his own community had commissioned, that my fence encroached onto HOA-controlled common land by roughly 4 feet along a 200-foot stretch. If that had been true, it would have been a reasonable thing to raise. Neighbors talk to neighbors. Boundaries get clarified. It happens all the time, and it doesn't have to be dramatic. But that is not what happened. Instead, I received a letter. Not a phone call, not a knock on the door, not even a certified letter with a return receipt, just a folded piece of paper stuffed into my mailbox, printed on HOA letterhead, informing me that my fence was, in the board's words, in clear violation of the established community boundary, and that I had 30 days to remove it or the association will take appropriate action to restore the property line. I read that letter twice. Then I went and got my folder. I keep a fireproof lockbox in my office with the important documents from the property, the original deed, the 1968 survey, my grandfather's correspondence with the county surveyor, and the updated deed transfers from when the land passed to my mother and then to me. I pulled out the 1968 survey, a slightly yellowed but perfectly legible document stamped by a licensed surveyor and filed with the county recorder's office that same year. It showed the eastern boundary in the exact location where my fence still stands today. Not close. Not approximate. Exakt. I decided to be a good neighbor about it. I photocopied the survey, wrote a polite cover letter explaining that the boundary had been established and recorded decades before Fairview Ridge existed, and mailed it to the HOA's office. I even offered to meet with the board in person to walk the line together, if there was any confusion. 2 weeks passed. No response. Then a second letter arrived, this one more aggressive in tone, claiming that the HOA's newly commissioned survey supersedes prior documentation, and that failure to comply within the amended timeline of 2 weeks would result in the association exercising its right to remove unauthorized structures encroaching on common area land. I want to pause here and say something for anyone watching this who is currently dealing with an HOA dispute of your own. A homeowners association does not have the authority to unilaterally override a county-filed property survey. An HOA can regulate things like fence height, fence material, and paint colors if your property falls under its governing documents. What an HOA cannot do is redraw the legal boundary of your land based on its own survey, and then treat that boundary as though it takes precedence over county records. That is not how property law works, in any state I am aware of. But knowing that in my head and getting an HOA board to accept it in practice turned out to be 2 very different challenges. I called the HOA office and finally got Gary Holloway on the phone. Mr. Holloway, I sent over documentation showing the original 1968 survey. That boundary has never changed. Your community survey may have been drawn incorrectly, or it may be measuring from a different reference point. I'd be glad to have both surveyors compare notes. Our survey was done by a licensed professional, Mr. Whitfield, he said. It's dated this year. It's current. I don't know what you've got there from 50 years ago, but our documentation is what the board is going by. With respect, the age of the document doesn't make it invalid. The county has had my grandfather's survey on file since 1968. That's the legal boundary. If your surveyor measured differently, that's worth investigating, but it doesn't erase what's already recorded. I hear you, he said, in the tone of a man who was not, in fact, hearing me at all. But the board has already voted. If the fence isn't relocated within the compliance window, we'll need to take further steps. I asked him directly what further steps meant. He didn't answer clearly. He said something vague about restoring the common area to its intended condition, and then he ended the call by telling me he had another meeting to get to. That was the moment I stopped trying to be purely reasonable and started being strategic instead. I am not a lawyer, but I have run a small business for over a decade, and if there is one lesson that experience taught me, it's this. When someone with more resources than you decides to escalate, you do not match their emotion, you match their documentation, and you make sure yours is better. The first thing I did was go straight to the county recorder's office. I requested a certified copy of the 1968 survey, along with a letter confirming its filing date and its unbroken chain of custody through every subsequent deed transfer. The clerk who helped me, a woman named Patricia who had clearly seen this kind of dispute before, printed everything I asked for and then added something I hadn't thought to request, a current parcel map showing the recorded boundary lines for both my property and the Fairview Ridge development, side by side. You're going to want this, she said. It shows exactly where the county considers the line to be, using the recorded surveys on file. If their survey doesn't match this, that's their problem, not yours. I thank her more than the moment probably called for, but she had just handed me the single most useful piece of paper in this entire story. The second thing I did was hire my own licensed surveyor, an independent third party with no connection to either me or the HOA, to walk the property and confirm, professionally and in writing, that my existing fence sat precisely on the boundary line established by the 1968 survey and matched the county's official parcel records. This cost me some money out of pocket, but I considered it the cheapest insurance I would ever buy. 2 weeks later, I had a fresh, dated, signed report confirming what I already knew. The fence was exactly where it was supposed to be, and had been for 50 years. The third thing I did was send the HOA a formal written response, not a friendly letter this time, but a certified letter with return receipt requested, including copies of the county-certified 1968 survey, the parcel map from the recorder's office, and my independent surveyor's report. I stated plainly, in writing, that the fence was located on a legally recorded boundary that predated the Fairview Ridge development by decades, that the HOA had no legal authority to alter or remove structures located on land outside its jurisdiction, and that any attempt to physically interfere with my property would be treated as trespassing and destruction of private property, and would be reported accordingly. I want to be honest with you, sending that letter felt satisfying, but it also made me nervous. I didn't know if it would actually stop anything. Some people, once they've committed publicly to a position, especially in front of a board and a group of neighbors, would rather double down than admit a mistake. And that is exactly what happened. About 3 weeks after I sent that letter, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, I heard the low rumble of heavy equipment coming from the direction of the fence line. I walked out to my back field and found a small crew standing near a compact bulldozer and a flatbed trailer, along with 2 men in polo shirts who I recognized from a photo on the HOA's website as board members. One of them was Gary Holloway. I want to describe this moment carefully, because I think it's the part of the story people are most curious about, and I want to be completely accurate rather than dramatic. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was being physically threatening. It was, on the surface, a fairly calm scene. Men in work boots standing near a machine, clipboards in hand, discussing where to begin. But underneath that calm was something that genuinely alarmed me. They were preparing, in broad daylight, to remove a 50-year-old fence from land that was legally mine, based on a survey that was legally wrong. I walked up to the group and asked what was happening. "Morning, Mr. Whitfield," Gary said, in the overly polite tone people use right before they do something they know is going to cause a problem. "We are moving forward with the boundary correction the board approved. We wanted to give you the courtesy of being here." "You received my certified letter," I said. "You have the county survey. You have the parcel map. You have an independent surveyor's report. All of it shows the fence is on the correct line." "Our survey shows otherwise," he said. "And legally, the board believes we are within our rights to restore the common area." I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that he was not within his rights, and that if that bulldozer moved 1 foot onto my land, I would be treating it as an act of trespassing and property destruction, and I would be documenting everything. Here is the part of this story I am most grateful for, and it is not dramatic in the way a movie scene would be, but it is exactly the kind of quiet, procedural, paperwork-driven ending that real disputes like this actually deserve. I had already called ahead. Before I ever walked out to that fence line, I had a strong suspicion this day was coming, because the HOA's letters had escalated in tone every single time, and Gary's phone call had made it clear the board had already voted before I ever spoke to him. So the night before, after noticing landscaping trucks and unfamiliar vehicles parked near the shared access road, I called the county's code enforcement office and also reached out to the sheriff's department's non-emergency line, explaining the situation and asking what my options were if a private organization attempted to remove a structure from land outside its jurisdiction. The dispatcher told me that if anything physical occurred, I should call immediately, and that a deputy could be sent to document the situation and prevent further action until ownership could be verified. I also, just to be thorough, emailed my county surveyor's report and the certified 1968 survey to the county's planning and zoning office that same evening, along with a brief explanation of the situation, simply so there would be a time-stamped record on file showing that I had proactively raised the issue before anything happened. So when I walked out to that fence line and found the bulldozer crew standing there, I was not walking out empty-handed. I had a folder in my hand containing physical copies of everything, and I had already made a phone call 5 minutes earlier. "Gary," I said, "I want to be clear with you before anything moves. I've already contacted the sheriff's department. I've already filed documentation with county planning and zoning. If that machine touches my fence, this stops being a boundary disagreement and becomes a criminal matter. I'd strongly encourage you to hold off until a deputy arrives to review the surveys with both of us present." I watched something shift in his face. Not anger exactly, more like the sudden, uncomfortable realization that the ground beneath his plan was a lot less solid than he'd assumed. "We have our own survey," he repeated, but with noticeably less confidence. "You have a survey from this year," I said. "I have a survey that has been on file with the county since 1968, 50 years before yours existed, and it has never been amended, contested, or overturned. If your survey conflicts with a 50-year-old recorded boundary, the recorded boundary wins. That's not my opinion. That's how property law works. I'd be glad to have both documents compared in front of a deputy or a county official, whichever you'd prefer." There was a long pause. The man operating the bulldozer looked over at Gary, clearly waiting for direction, clearly also uncomfortable with the idea of operating heavy machinery near a homeowner who had just mentioned the sheriff's department. About 20 minutes later, a patrol vehicle pulled up the shared access road. The deputy who arrived was calm and businesslike, the kind of person who has clearly mediated 100 property disputes and finds them mildly tedious rather than exciting. I handed him my folder. He looked through the county-certified 1968 survey, the parcel map from the recorder's office, and my independent surveyor's report. Then he asked to see the HOA's documentation. Gary produced a printed copy of the survey his board had commissioned. The deputy looked at it for a while, flipped it over, checked the surveyor's license number against something on his phone, and then asked a question that, in hindsight, was the single most important sentence spoken that entire morning. "Is this survey filed with the county recorder's office?" Gary hesitated. It's an internal survey the board commissioned. I'm not sure it's been formally filed yet." "So it's not on record," the deputy said, more as a statement than a question. "Not yet, no." The deputy nodded slowly, handed the paper back, and turned to address both of us. "Here's where things stand, from what I can see. This gentleman has a boundary survey filed with the county in 1968, confirmed against the current parcel map, and backed up by an independent survey completed this year. That's a recorded, verifiable legal boundary. What you have is an unfiled internal document. Until that's formally recorded and, if there's a genuine discrepancy, resolved through the county or through a civil boundary dispute process, I can't allow any structure to be removed from land the recorded documents show belongs to him. If that equipment moves onto this property today, that becomes a trespassing and property damage complaint, and I'll be documenting it as such." I will not pretend I didn't feel a wave of relief, so strong my hands were shaking slightly as I folded the papers back into my folder. Gary didn't argue with the deputy. To his credit, He didn't try to push the point any further in that moment. He thanked the deputy, told the crew to load the equipment back onto the trailer, and the whole operation packed up and left within the hour. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was cited. The fence never lost so much as a single post. I wish I could tell you the story ended right there, with the trailer driving off into the distance, but real disputes usually have a slightly longer tail than that, and I think that tail is actually the more useful part of the story for anyone watching who is dealing with something similar. Over the following month, I worked with a real estate attorney, mostly just for an hour of paid consultation to make sure I understood my options correctly. She confirmed everything the deputy had already told us. A recorded survey takes precedence over an unfiled internal document. An HOA's authority generally extends only to land it actually owns or has recorded easements over, and any physical removal of my fence without a court order or a legitimate resolved boundary dispute would have exposed the HOA, and potentially individual board members, to real liability. She helped me draft one more letter, calm and precise, laying out the full legal picture and requesting that the HOA formally withdraw its claim regarding the fence line, given the documented history of the recorded boundary. I sent that letter, along with copies of everything the deputy had reviewed, to the full HOA board, not just to Gary. To the board's credit, once the full documentation was in front of more than one person, and once it became clear that continuing to push the issue carried real legal risk for the association itself, they backed down completely. At their next general meeting, the board issued a written retraction acknowledging that their commissioned survey had not accounted for the recorded 1968 boundary and confirming that no further action would be taken regarding the fence. I heard through a neighbor that the HOA surveyor had made an error involving an outdated reference marker, essentially measuring from the wrong starting point, which is apparently a more common mistake than people realize. It wasn't malicious on the surveyor's part. It was simply sloppy, and it became the board's problem the moment they decided to act on it without checking the county records first. Gary and I have actually spoken a couple of times since then, and I don't think he's a villain in this story. I think he's a well-meaning volunteer who trusted a document without verifying it against the one source that actually mattered, the county recorder, and who let frustration push him toward an aggressive action before he'd done his homework. I've told him, honestly, that if the board had simply reached out and asked to compare surveys from the beginning, this entire thing could have been resolved with a friendly conversation and a shared cup of coffee instead of a bulldozer sitting in my field. If there's a lesson in all of this, I think it's a simple one, and it applies to a lot more than just fences. Keep your documents. Keep your original paperwork, your deeds, your surveys, your correspondence, no matter how old they seem or how irrelevant they feel in the moment. 50-year-old paper won a fight against a brand new bulldozer, not because it was old, but because it was correct, and because it was properly filed with the one authority that actually settles these questions. And if you ever find yourself facing an organization that seems more interested in asserting its authority than in checking its facts, don't match their aggression. Match their paperwork. Get everything in writing. Get it certified. Get an independent professional to confirm your position. And know exactly who to call before the moment arrives when you actually need them. My fence is still standing exactly where my grandfather put it in 1968. It'll probably still be standing another 50 years from now, long after this particular HOA dispute is nothing but an old story a few of us tell each other at the mailbox. And every single time I walk that line, I think about how close it came to being torn out over a mistake that one afternoon of checking county records could have prevented entirely. There's one more part of this story I want to share, because I think it matters just as much as the morning the bulldozer showed up. A few weeks after the HOA issued its written retraction, I got a knock on my door on a Saturday afternoon. It wasn't Gary. It was a woman named Renata, who lived 2 houses down inside Fairview Ridge and had been on the board for less than a year. She wasn't there to argue. She was there to apologize, and to ask a question that stuck with me for a long time afterward. I voted for that plan, she told me, standing on my porch with her hands in her jacket pockets. I didn't check anything myself. Somebody on the board said the survey was solid, and I just went along with it because I trusted the process. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't had those old papers. I told her the truth. If I hadn't kept that folder, if my grandfather hadn't filed that survey properly back in 1968, or if I hadn't taken the time to track down a certified copy the moment that first letter arrived, that morning could have gone very differently. Fences get torn out over exactly this kind of situation more often than people realize, not because the homeowner was wrong, but because the homeowner couldn't prove they were right quickly enough, in front of the right people, at the right moment. That conversation with Renata ended up changing something at Fairview Ridge that I think is worth mentioning. At the board's next meeting, they adopted a new internal policy. Before the HOA sends any letter alleging a boundary encroachment, someone is required to pull the property's recorded survey history directly from the county recorder's office and compare it against whatever the HOA's own contractor has produced. If there's a conflict between the two, the matter goes to a neutral third-party surveyor before any letter goes out, let alone before any equipment gets scheduled. Gary told me later that the policy passed unanimously, without a single objection, which tells you something about how differently people see these situations once they've actually watched one nearly go wrong. I don't share that part to make myself sound like some kind of local hero. I share it because it's the actual, unglamorous outcome that matters most. Nobody sued anybody. Nobody's name ended up attached to a lawsuit that would follow them around for years. A neighborhood association simply learned, the hard way, to check its paperwork before acting on it, and a family's 50-year-old fence line stayed exactly where 2 generations of my family had always known it belonged. I think about my grandfather sometimes when I walk that boundary now, an 11-acre stretch of land he bought with money he'd saved for years, back when this whole area was still farmland and gravel roads and nobody could have imagined a development like Fairview Ridge going up next door. He couldn't have known, when he paid a surveyor to walk that line and file the paperwork with the county in 1968, that the piece of paper he was filing away in a drawer would end up being the exact thing that stopped a bulldozer from crossing it more than 50 years later. But that's the strange, quiet power of doing things properly the first time. You don't always see the payoff right away. Sometimes it takes decades. But when the moment comes, if the paperwork is right, it holds. If you've ever dealt with an HOA overstepping its authority, or a neighbor dispute that only got resolved once the right documents landed on the right desk, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. These situations are more common than people think, and the more we talk about how they actually get resolved, calmly, with paperwork, and without anyone needing to raise their voice, the better prepared the next person will be when it happens to them.